Welcome back to The Static, my friends. You've tuned in to Channel 19 Mysteries, and I'm your host, Midnight Rider. Have you ever driven down an empty stretch of highway in the dead of night and felt watched? We put blind trust in our vehicles. We expect our headlights to pierce the darkness and our engines to carry us safely through the absolute isolation of the deep woods. But what happens when that machinery betrays us? What happens when the power dies? The radio goes silent, and you are forced to step out into the freezing fog of the ancient redwoods, only to discover that the forest has been claimed by something entirely unnatural. Tonight, we are unearthing a buried event from 1985. It's a terrifying encounter from a rugged, no-nonsense man who knew the coastal roads better than anyone, but discovered the hard way that humanity is merely a guest in the deep timber. Before we dim the lights and venture into the fog, please take a second to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below. Have you ever experienced an unexplained blackout or seen something impossible on a lonely stretch of road? Let me know in the comments. Now, let's get into tonight's story. A tow truck driver's worst nightmare. If you were to drive up the Pacific coast of the United States, specifically along the winding, heavily forested stretches of United States Route 101, you would immediately understand why this area is the subject of so many local legends. The highway cuts directly through ancient, old-growth redwood forests. These trees are massive, some towering over 300 feet into the air with trunks so wide you could drive a car through them. During the day, it is a breathtaking, scenic route. But at night, Highway 101 transforms. The towering trees block out the moonlight, the dense fog rolls in off the Pacific Ocean, and the winding road becomes a corridor of absolute, suffocating darkness. In the fall of 1985, this stretch of highway was even more isolated than it is today. Cell phones did not exist. If you broke down, you were entirely reliant on the hope that a passing highway patrolman or a fellow motorist would spot you. Or you had to hope your citizens band, or CB, radio could punch a signal through the dense timber. Arthur Hemlock knew this highway better than anyone. Arthur, who went by Art to everyone who knew him, was a 42-year-old tow truck driver working for a company called Coastal Recovery and Towing, based out of Crescent City, California. Art was the definition of a blue-collar professional. He was a military veteran who had served in the motor pool during his time in the service, meaning he understood heavy machinery inside and out. He was a pragmatic, no-nonsense man who did not believe in ghost stories, did not care for urban legends, and spent his nights hauling wrecked or stalled vehicles out of the treacherous ravines and dark shoulders of the 101. He was widely considered to be an incredibly reliable, grounded individual. If Art told you an engine block was cracked, it was cracked. If Art told you he saw something, he saw it. The night of October 23rd, 1985, began like any other autumn shift for Art. It was a Tuesday. The weather was typical for the Northern California coast in late October. A bone-chilling dampness in the air, temperatures hovering in the low 40s, and a thick, soupy marine layer of fog clinging to the asphalt. At approximately 11:45 in the evening, Art was sitting in the cab of his rig at the Coastal Recovery lot, drinking coffee from a battered thermos, when the dispatch radio crackled to life. The voice on the other end belonged to Brenda Hayes, the night dispatcher who had worked with Art for 5 years. Brenda informed Art that a call had just been relayed from the highway patrol. A motorist named Steve Jones was stranded on a particularly desolate stretch of Highway 101 about 20 miles south of Crescent City near the Klamath River Bridge. The motorist's station wagon had suffered a catastrophic alternator failure and was dead on the shoulder. Art acknowledged the call, set his coffee cup in the holder, and fired up his rig. Art's truck was not a standard run-of-the-mill tow truck. Because he regularly had to pull massive logging trucks and heavy commercial vehicles out of steep ditches, Art drove a custom heavy-duty Kenworth W900 wrecker. It was a massive, roaring beast of a machine, painted high-visibility yellow, equipped with dual winches, a reinforced steel boom, and a diesel engine that shook the ground when it idled. It was the kind of truck that made you feel invincible when you sat behind the wheel. As Art pulled out of the lot, and headed south onto Highway 101, he had no idea that he was driving directly into an event that would completely dismantle his understanding of reality, end his career, and leave him with psychological scars he would carry for the rest of his life. The first 15 miles of the drive were entirely unremarkable. Art listened to the deep, rhythmic rumble of his Kenworth's diesel engine and the steady, hypnotic thwap, thwap, thwap of his windshield wipers pushing the heavy mist away. The headlights of his massive truck cut through the fog, illuminating the towering walls of redwoods that lined both sides of the two-lane highway. But as Art approached the 18-mile mark, entering a section of the highway where the trees grow so close to the pavement that their branches form a literal tunnel over the road, the atmosphere inside the cab began to change. It started with the CB radio. Usually, even in the dead of night, the CB radio would pick up scattered chatter from long-haul truckers pushing through the coastal route. But right around midnight, the radio went entirely dead. There wasn't even the standard white noise or static. It was just a flat, heavy silence. Art reached over and tapped the dial, thinking a fuse might have blown. He turned the squelch knob back and forth, but the speaker remained completely unresponsive. He muttered to himself, assuming the dense canopy of ancient trees and the thick fog were just messing with the radio waves, which wasn't entirely unheard of in this area. But then the mechanical anomalies began. The Kenworth W900 was a purely mechanical beast. In 1985, heavy trucks did not rely on the complex computer modules and electronic control units that modern vehicles use today. They were built on compression, fuel, and heavy-duty alternators. It took a massive physical failure to stop a truck like this. As Art crested a slight incline, plunging deeper into the redwood corridor, the dashboard lights inside his cab began to flicker. It wasn't a steady dimming. It was a rapid, erratic pulsing, like a strobe light. The heavy analog gauges, the tachometer, the oil pressure, the battery voltage, all suddenly pegged all the way to the right, maxing out violently before dropping to absolute zero. Before Art could even process what was happening to his instruments, the massive diesel engine, which had been roaring steadily just a second before, let out a violent, unnatural shudder. It sounded as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the cylinders. The engine didn't sputter or cough, it simply seized into absolute silence. Simultaneously, the high-beam headlights, the amber clearance lights on the roof, and the heavy halogen work lights on the back of the wrecker all popped and died. Art was suddenly plunging forward at 50 miles per hour in pitch-black darkness, steering a 15-ton piece of dead metal. Relying purely on muscle memory and panic, Art wrestled with the massive, unpowered steering wheel, fighting the dead weight of the truck to keep it on the asphalt. He slammed his foot onto the brake pedal, but without the engine running, the air compressors were dead, meaning the air brakes locked up violently. The massive tires shrieked against the wet pavement as the heavy wrecker skidded, the back end fishtailing slightly before Art managed to wrestle it onto the narrow dirt shoulder. The truck shuddered to a violent halt, and then there was nothing but silence. Art sat gripping the steering wheel, his chest heaving, his eyes wide in the absolute crushing darkness. For a man who knew engines, this made no sense. A diesel engine does not just instantly turn off, and a heavy-duty electrical system doesn't just evaporate. It felt as if the truck had driven into an invisible wall that simply deleted all electricity and combustion. He tried to turn the ignition key. Nothing. Not a click of the starter, not a flicker of a dome light. The Kenworth was completely and utterly dead. At this point, Art assumed he had suffered some sort of catastrophic, 1 in a million catastrophic electrical short that somehow grounded out the entire vehicle. He took a deep breath, reached into the passenger seat, and grabbed his heavy 4-cell aluminum maglite flashlight. He unlatched his door and pushed it open. When Art stepped out of the cab and his boots hit the damp pine needles on the shoulder of the highway, the first thing that hit him was the smell. There is a very specific scent to a redwood forest. In the rain, it smells of rich soil, damp bark, and fresh pine. But that smell was completely gone. Instead, the air smelled sharply of ozone, copper, and something deeply chemical, like burning electrical wires mixed with an industrial welding shop. It was an acrid, metallic taste that coated the back of his throat. The second thing he noticed was the temperature. When he had left Crescent City, it was a chilly 42 degrees, but standing outside his truck, the air was blisteringly cold. It felt unnaturally freezing, as if the temperature had plummeted 20 degrees the moment his truck died. Every breath he took plumed into thick white clouds in front of his face. Art flicked on his heavy maglite. The powerful beam of light sliced through the thick fog, illuminating the massive, rough-barked trunks of the redwoods lining the road. He walked to the front of his Kenworth, intending to pop the massive fiberglass hood to inspect the battery banks and the alternator. But as he reached for the hood latch, he stopped. He realized he was listening to a sound that he had never heard before in his life. When you are alone in a dense forest, silence is never truly silent. There's always the sound of wind rustling the branches, the distant sound of water dripping from the canopy, or the scurrying of nocturnal animals. But there was no wind. The fog hung completely stagnant in the air. Yet, there was a sound. It was coming from directly above him, high up in the dense, interlocking canopy of the massive trees. Art later described it to authorities as a deeply rhythmic, low-frequency thrumming. It was a vibration that he felt in his molars and in the soles of his boots before he actually processed it with his ears. It sounded like the idle of a massive, impossibly huge machine. Mixed with this deep tectonic vibration was a high-pitched metallic whine, a rhythmic sh-clack, sh-clack, sh-clack that sounded distinctly like heavy hydraulic pistons extending and retracting. Art slowly stepped away from the front of his truck. He moved to the center of the dark, empty highway, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. He gripped his heavy flashlight tightly and tilted the beam upward, aiming it straight into the black canopy, 150 feet above his head. What he saw in the beam of his flashlight is the reason Arthur Hemlock never drove a truck again, and the reason he refused to ever step foot near a forest for the rest of his life. The trees were moving, but they were not swaying in the wind. As Art's powerful flashlight beam cut through the mist, it illuminated the upper branches of a massive, ancient redwood directly over the highway. But the branches weren't covered in bark or pine needles. They were massive, articulated, matte black mechanical limbs. Art froze in absolute terror, his mind desperately trying to rationalize what his eyes were seeing. High above him, weaving seamlessly through the biological canopy of the forest, was an architecture of impossible, non-terrestrial machinery. The limbs were enormous, some appearing to be as thick as a city bus, and they were jointed in a way that vaguely resembled the legs of an insect, but made entirely of smooth, light-absorbing metal. They were moving with a horrifying, calculated precision. As Art stood paralyzed in the center of the road, staring upward, he realized he was looking at an active harvest. The rhythmic, hydraulic sh-clack sound he was hearing was the sound of these massive metallic appendages working. The mechanical limbs were wrapping around the colossal trunks of the redwoods. Art watched, completely spellbound by the sheer biomechanical terror of the sight, as one of the massive metal appendages extended a series of smaller, violently fast, multi-jointed tools that clamped onto a thick section of a tree. There was a sudden, blinding flash of a dark, violet light, a light so intense it left an afterimage burned into Art's retinas, and in absolute silence, a 40-foot section of the massive redwood's trunk simply ceased to exist. It wasn't cut, it wasn't sawed, it was simply removed. The upper portion of the massive tree, which should have come crashing down with thousands of pounds of force, was being held perfectly in place by the mechanical limbs suspended in midair as if gravity had simply been turned off in that specific quadrant of the forest. Art couldn't breathe. The sheer scale of the machinery hiding in the darkness above him was incomprehensible. As his eyes adjusted, he realized that the metallic limbs weren't just on one tree. They stretched across the entire canopy, forming a massive, shifting, metallic web that seemed to extend for acres in every direction. The entire forest ceiling had been replaced by a sprawling industrial harvesting operation belonging to something entirely alien. The deep, low-frequency thrumming grew louder, vibrating the asphalt beneath Art's boots. He watched as the mechanical limbs manipulated the massive, severed sections of the ancient trees, pulling them upward into the impenetrable darkness above the fog line, where they disappeared entirely. Art was a logical man. His brain demanded an explanation. Was this some secret military operation? Some new experimental logging technology? But the sheer impossibility of the physics, the silent removal of matter, the manipulation of gravity, the fact that an entire power grid and his purely mechanical truck had been silenced shattered any logical defense his mind could construct. He was standing beneath a leviathan, a non-terrestrial factory ship that had draped itself over the remote Oregon-California border, quietly and systematically harvesting the ancient biomass of the planet in the dead of night. Suddenly, the rhythm of the machinery changed. The hydraulic sh-clack sounds stopped. The deep vibration shifted in pitch, turning into a sharp, grating hum. High above, one of the massive, matte black limbs stopped moving. Slowly, the enormous, multi-jointed appendage pivoted. It lowered slightly, dropping just below the cover of the biological branches, and pointed directly downward. Directly at Art. Though there were no visible lenses or eyes on the machine, Art felt an overwhelming, crushing sensation of being perceived. The ozone smell in the air suddenly became so thick, he began to choke. The hair on his arms and the back of his neck stood straight up as the air crackled with a massive buildup of static electricity. The primal survival instinct of a man who had been through combat finally broke through the paralyzing shock. Art dropped the flashlight. It hit the pavement with a loud clatter, the beam rolling wildly across the road. He didn't look up again. He turned and sprinted toward his dead Kenworth wrecker with everything he had. The sheer panic in his chest was so intense, he felt like his heart was going to tear itself apart. He threw open the heavy driver's side door, scrambled into the cab, and slammed the door shut, immediately locking it and rolling up the window in a frantic, panicked frenzy. He dove down into the passenger footwell, curling his body into a tight ball, pressing his back against the heavy steel transmission tunnel and covering his head with his hands. He waited for the roof of his cab to be peeled back. He waited to be pulled up into the sky. He waited for the blinding violet light. For what felt like an eternity, Art lay in the dark, violently shaking, listening. The high-pitched hum outside grew louder, vibrating the very steel of his truck. The air pressure inside the cab began to drop so rapidly, his ears popped painfully. He could hear the massive, metallic limbs shifting just outside, the sound echoing through the dense fog. And then, just as suddenly as the event had begun, it ended. There was a sound like a massive thunderclap that shook the truck so violently, Art was thrown against the door panel. It was followed instantly by the deafening roar of the Kenworth's massive diesel engine roaring back to life. The dashboard lights blazed back on, blinding him. The high-beam headlights pierced the fog. The CB radio exploded with static and overlapping voices. The heater blasted hot air onto his face. The blackout was over. Art stayed curled in the footwell for nearly 10 minutes, sobbing uncontrollably, his mind entirely broken by the sheer terror of what he had just witnessed. Slowly, agonizingly, he pulled himself up into the driver's seat. He looked out the windshield. The road was empty. The fog was drifting lazily across the pavement. There was no deep vibration. There was no smell of ozone. He looked up at the canopy. The high beams caught the tops of the redwoods, swaying gently in the returning ocean breeze. It looked like a normal, undisturbed forest. Art did not get out to retrieve his flashlight. He slammed the truck into gear, his hands shaking so violently he could barely operate the heavy shifter, and he stood on the accelerator. He abandoned the stranded motorist call entirely. He drove the massive wrecker south towards Klamath at speeds exceeding 70 miles an hour, taking corners so fast the heavy truck nearly flipped, absolutely desperate to escape the tree line. He didn't stop until he reached an all-night diner on the outskirts of Klamath, completely brightly lit and surrounded by open parking space. He parked the truck across 5 spaces, locked the doors, and sat in the cab until the sun came up, refusing to move. When morning finally broke, Art drove directly to the local sheriff's substation. The officer on duty, a veteran deputy named Hank Cobb, knew Art well. When Art walked through the doors of the station, his face was the color of ash. His clothes were soaked in sweat, and his hands were trembling uncontrollably. Art sat in Deputy Cobb's office and recounted the entire event. He told him about the blackout, the dead truck, the ozone, the mechanical limbs, and the harvesting. Art knew exactly how crazy he sounded. He fully expected Cobb to laugh him out of the room, to tell him he had fallen asleep at the wheel and had a night terror. But Deputy Cobb didn't laugh. Instead, his expression grew incredibly grim. Cobb told Art that at exactly midnight, the entire power grid, from Crescent City down to Eureka, had experienced an inexplicable, massive surge and subsequent blackout. The local power company claimed a massive, freak lightning strike had taken out a primary substation, despite the fact that there was not a single storm cloud in the sky that night. Furthermore, Cobb revealed that the highway patrol had been out all night dealing with reports of vehicles stalling out entirely on the 101, their electrical systems completely fried. But what deeply chilled Deputy Cobb was what he found later that afternoon. Because Art had filed an official report, Cobb felt obligated to drive out to the exact mile marker where Art claimed his truck had died. When Cobb arrived at the location, he found Art's heavy aluminum mag light resting exactly where Art said he had dropped it in the middle of the road. But it was what Cobb saw when he looked up that confirmed Art Hemlock had not been hallucinating. Deep in the canopy, nearly 200 feet up, hidden from the casual view of the road, but visible if you knew exactly where to look, a massive section of the old-growth timber was simply gone. Cobb hiked up the steep embankment to get a better vantage point. He found 3 ancient redwood trees that had been completely decapitated. The trunks, which were nearly 10 feet in diameter at that height, had been severed, but there was no sawdust. There were no wood chips. The tops of the trees hadn't fallen to the forest floor. They had vanished completely. And the cuts on the massive stumps were not made by chainsaws. Cobb stared through his binoculars in absolute disbelief. The cuts were perfectly smooth, highly polished, and reflective, as if the wood had been sheared on a microscopic level or turned to glass by immense, unfathomable heat. The wood was completely cauterized. No human logging operation in 1985 possessed the technology to make a cut like that, let alone do it 200 feet in the air, in the middle of the night, without leaving a single trace of debris. Deputy Cobb took several photographs of the stumps and filed them in his official report. But within 2 weeks, the report was quietly buried. The official explanation handed down by the State Forestry Department was that a freak microburst of wind had snapped the trees, and the smooth appearance of the wood was due to unusual weather-related friction. The localized blackout and the stalled vehicles were firmly attributed to a blown transformer. But Arthur Hemlock knew the truth. He knew what he had seen in the beam of his flashlight. Art quit coastal recovery and towing the very next day. He surrendered his commercial driver's license. The man who had spent his entire life pulling people out of the dark, winding roads of the Pacific Northwest packed up his home and moved to the flat, treeless deserts of Nevada. Until the day he passed away, Arthur Hemlock refused to ever drive a vehicle after sunset. And if anyone ever asked him why he left the beautiful forests of California, he would look at them with a completely hollow stare, and he would tell them that humanity is completely oblivious to what happens in the deep woods when the grid goes down. He would tell them that we think the forests belong to us, but the truth is, when the darkness truly falls, we are just standing in the middle of someone else's harvest. What do you guys think Arthur Hemlock really saw suspended above Highway 101 that night? Are we truly just standing in the middle of someone else's harvest when the lights go out? Let me know your theories down in the comments below. If this story sent a chill down your spine, please hit that like button and subscribe to Channel 19 Mysteries. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a trip into the unknown. I'm your host, Midnight Rider, and I'm always looking for new mysteries to uncover. If you have any of your own stories, creepy encounters, or unexplained phenomena that you'd like to share, you can send them directly to me at mycreepyencounter@gmail.com. Your experience just might be the focus of our next video. Until next time, stay safe out there.